Alright guys, Jay's Rides here, coming to you with another how-to video. This one's going to be how to check valve clearance and to check your timing chain for tension, make sure it's tight and all that. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is remove these side panels. And these are removed with a T25 wrench. Okay, do the same on the other side, and the next bolts that come out are going to be holding the seat in. We're going to be working with a T40 on those. I also need to mention that these come off with a clip at the back end here. It goes on the underside. You will have to pop that out, but I don't have them on mine just because they're a pain, they're in the way, and there's really no use to them. Okay, so we got the seat off. Okay, next thing we're going to remove are these two front bolts up here. And this holds the front end of the gas tank on. So once they're removed, the gas tank will actually tilt up backwards. Don't forget the washers that come on these. Okay, now this gives us full access to lift the gas tank. You can see that I actually propped mine right on the frame there. Just holding the tank up like that. Now we have full access to our rear cylinder head. Okay, now the top of the cylinder head has 3 bolts that hold the valve cover on. So you want to remove your spark plug boot, get that out of the way. And we'll be using another T40 to get these off. Okay, now these are in there really well, so I've had to break out my half-inch pry bar. Okay, so we got all 3 of those loose, we'll just take them off. After you get those bolts out, this actually pops off pretty easily. And be sure you bring the gasket with it. Or better yet, just leave it on the cylinder head. There we go, now it's off. Now if you look here, you can actually see the cam lobe where it meets up with the valves down in here and here. Now what you need to do is make sure that the engine is cranked to where this cylinder is at top dead center. Afterwards you can use your feeler gauges to measure each one and see what the gap is. And from there you can determine which one needs to be replaced, and if so, what size you need. So first things first is we actually need to remove our cam covers. That's going to be these two, and these 2 bolts. Once those are removed, you'll actually be able to lift the cam, and that will give you access to viewing what's going on with your valves. See if they're bent or if they're cracked or leaking or anything. Alright guys, now on this side of the rear cylinder head, you're going to see this little metal cover here. It's held on by 2 T30 bolts on the front and 1 just back here. Remove all 3 of them, and this is going to allow you to check your cam chain, see if it's tight, loose, if it looks worn, anything like that. So I already removed the one in the back. Just pull that cover off and you can now check your cam chain. Now basically what you're looking for is any excessive play. You can see I can actually push on this a decent amount, but it doesn't really move that much. That's good. That means there's good tension on this. The other thing is on the back side of this plate, you'll see a rubber slider or an acrylic slider. this is what the top of the cam chain rubs against. When the motor's running, that chain actually shoots up a little bit due to centrifugal force and rubs along this. So you'll want to check and be sure this isn't worn. Looks like, I mean, this one was done about 30,000 miles ago, and this one's actually in good shape. But if this chain was loose, that's when you have to start worrying about getting the cylinder head off and getting to the chain tensioner that's on the back side of the cylinder and replacing the actual these that are on each side of the cylinder that keep the chain taut. So in our case, this one looks good, but that's something you're going to want to check while you're in here. Okay, now on the left side of the motor here, you're going to see this little plug. This is going to have to be removed because in order to get the cams in top dead center, the piston in top dead center to get the cams to face upwards, we have to rotate the engine. Now this comes off with a T55. Remove the plug. This is one of those gaskets that you will most likely need to replace because it gets very corroded very easily and doesn't really tend to last very well, so you'll want to get a new one of these. Now once that's off, you're actually going to be using an 11/16 socket in order to get in here and rotate the engine. Now if you look at mine, my lobes are actually already sticking up to an extent. We're just going to rotate it enough until they point upwards at a completely different angle. Until they're almost pointing up. And what this does is allows the smallest portion of the cam lobe to be up against the valve tappet, which gives you the most accurate reading between the two. Okay, so now I'm going to rotate this clockwise, and as I do, we'll watch these rotate up here. There we go. See, now they're pointing almost straight up. This is going to allow us to get the feeler gauge down in there and see what the actual distance is between each one. Now another thing is if you actually look at the top of these, you'll see IN for intake and EX for exhaust. So this is your intake reading and your exhaust reading. So what I've done here is I've scribbled out on a piece of paper what the essential layout of the engine is going to be. So this is going to be your rear cylinder head, this is going to be your front. This is front of vehicle, so when you're sitting on the bike, you're looking that way. Now this is the cylinder head we're working on right now, and we are going to have the right rear, left rear, which will be the exhaust ports, the right front and left front, which will be the intake. So we'll be using this feeler gauge to measure the distance between the two. Now, in order to check that the cylinder is actually at top dead center for the rear, you're going to want to remove this bolt as well, because that'll give you a reading off the gear that's in there with either an F for front or R for rear, and you're going to want to line it up with this little notch that's back here. So here's what it looks like when you have the rear cylinder head lined up. So I am currently using the 0.008. Okay, now another thing is you do want to make sure that this job is done when the engine is cold. Obviously metal expands when it's hot, so at a cold state it's where it was when it was originally put together in the factory when they tested tolerances. So just be sure that the engine is cold before you attempt to make your measurements. So here's a look at the intake. Now I'm going to take a 0.008 millimeter and try to fit it in between the rocker and the tappet. Now, as you can see, I can't even fit an 8 millimeter in here. I mean, I can wiggle it and I can kind of get it stuck, but it's actually closer than that. See, it pops right out. but I was barely able to get this 8 in there. Now doing it to the other side as well, I get roughly the same response. Barely fits underneath. And it's even the same with the exhaust side as well. So in my instance, what I'm running into is my shims are actually too close. They're the tappet shims that were used were too big. I'm presuming that the person who did this before me did that in an attempt to make sure that it didn't have to be adjusted for a very, very long time. It's still really not good for the engine, because you do need these clearances between 10 and 20 millimeters in order to achieve a correctly running engine. Okay, so when you get to where you actually have to replace them with different sizes, you're basically going to take the measurements that you have now. Like if a 10 fits in there, you're good. Anything between a 10 and a 20. But if it's like 25, then you're going to need to add a 0.005 to the shim that's already in here. So once you pull the shim out, you'll see what it is and add 0.005 to that. Now, like I said, you're going to have to remove intakes, so you have 6 bolts on top of this. Once you pull that off, you'll have full access to your cam. The cam comes out with the sprocket, so you're going to have to find a way to hold your chain up. And make sure that you also mark the sprocket and the chain with like a paint tool, like a paint pen, something that's going to tell you where to line it up when you're done. Don't let it fall into the engine, because you'll have to take it apart in order to get to it. This will prevent you from having to time the engine later. Now basically, once you get them off, you're going to see the tappets on top, which you can actually just pull right off. And the shims are going to be right in the center there. See the basic measurements that they get. So this is a layout. You got the tappet on top, the shim right in the middle, which this is what separates this from the top of the valve. So you don't have to go any further in removing the tappet and the shim. But take the shim out, the number on the top will tell you what the thickness is, and then just add however much you need to that, and you can order it from there. That's if you want to order individually. Otherwise, you can get like a shim kit for $80, comes with 3 of every size. Now, the procedure for the front will be roughly the same as the rear, only the cam chain is actually on this side of the engine, and that will read F instead of R. Now, if you want to see the actual teardown on how to get to that cylinder, you can check out my video for spark plug change. That gets rid of all of this material, like your radiator, your horn, gets all that out of the way so you can actually get to the cylinder head and do the same procedure on the rear for the front. Now, in response to Piston Rod's video, one thing that I would check on the vehicle is to see if, when the vehicle's running, if it smells like excess fuel, like it's not getting burnt up in the cylinder properly and it's just spewing out here. That would indicate that one of the valves is bad. Another one, check your spark plugs. If they're exceptionally wet, then there's a good chance that you have fuel that is not combusting properly. Well guys, hope that helps out with some of you with figuring out how to check the clearance on your valves on the SV650.